0 survivors. The words crack like a rune carved into a burned plank. Absolute, obscene, unforgettable. For a people whose name still shimmers in sagas and sea charts, the idea of their fleets coming home with nothing left to show but smoke and splinters is a small apocalypse. It rewrites the tidy story most of us learned. Vikings as masters of wind and wave, invincible on the water that lay between their longhouses and the riches of the east. 3 centuries of crossing the gray, island-strewn Baltic had taught them to treat the sea as a backyard. Longships moved like knives across that shallow desert. Raiding was as routine as market day, and the northern lords assumed the same logic would hold wherever they pointed their prows. They read shorelines as maps of permission, open villages, fat cattle to take, monasteries to sack, and, crucially, coasts that could be forced with a shout and a spear. Complacency is not dramatic, it is a habit, and habits die harder than men. On the other shore, where the forests met the sea in reed and bog and the stars had other names, a different kind of habit was forming. Adaptation. The people who lived among the islands and inlets, the Coronians, sometimes transcribed as Coronians, the Oecelians, the islanders of Oesel, also seen in some records as Oecelians, the Semigallians, and a loose knot of allied Baltic clans, including the forebears of what would later be called Lithuanians, watched the Drakars with an eye that recorded weakness rather than awe. They learned that what carried terror could also carry burden. A great hull that cut the open sea was a liability in narrow channels. A crew mustering for open battle was slow to react to a dozen skiffs slipping among reeds at dawn. These were not one tribe with a banner and a central command. They were a coalition. Fishermen, raiders, woodsmen, and craftsmen who shared coastline and grievance. They had their own sea craft, low-draft boats that could run where a Drakar would founder, that could be hauled under cover of a sandspit, that could vanish into a bay the size of a courtyard. They learned to use weather and geography as weapons. The Baltic, for all its reputation as a place for broad sweeps of sail, is full of traps, shoals that appear out of nowhere, narrow straits with currents like fingers, islands that multiply like chess pieces. The tribes began to fight not by confronting the Viking strengths, but by turning them into vulnerabilities. Innovation in war is rarely flashy until it is. It begins in small, practical changes. One boat was built lighter, the next shortened the mast and kept more oars. Men who had once feared open combat learned to fight from concealment. They practiced approaches that blurred the lines between raid and ambush, sliding close under the lee of a skerry at night, lighting a signal fire on a lonely rock, then striking when a Viking ship rounded the point and found its lee already occupied. They developed incendiaries that could leap from an oar splinter to a tarred sail. They learned to board from the stern, to cut lines instead of meeting shields, to weaponize the wind itself by setting sails ablaze. These were small things, each one easy to shrug off in a world that still told stories of axe and shore, until the day a Viking fleet arrived at a place where the map was full of tricks. The first shocks that break an empire are often almost undetectable. A ship that fails to return, a raid that meets delay rather than triumph, a small village that resists. The chroniclers in the north, thin, Christian, patchwork in their irony, later wrote of early disappearances along the coast. A war party left for plunder and vanished into a fog of reeds. A messenger did not make it back. Stories that would once have been local rumors mutated into legend because the same pattern repeated itself. Men who trusted the sea found the sea answering in a voice they did not expect. Not every account agrees on where the first murderous lesson landed. Some sources point to Gotland. Gotland appears in various texts as the site of a decisive ambush, where islanders found Viking pride a poor shield against tactics designed specifically to shatter the longship's advantage. Others focus on the events on the Swedish mainland, culminating in the sack of Sigtuna, an image that terrified the north. Sigtuna, often dated to 1187 in many chronicles, though details and responsibility are debated by modern scholars, became a bruise that would not heal. Contemporary records are fragmentary. The exact actors and the full course of events are disputed, but whether it was Gotland or Sigtuna, What followed in the collective memory was the same. The North had been struck where it felt most secure. Imagine then a gray morning over Sigtuna. Smoke blotches the sun. Bells do not ring. The weight of metal is mute or broken. The cathedral doors, those thick oaken thresholds that mark the edge between holiness and violence, are torn, according to some accounts, as though a hand had ripped the town's skin. Chroniclers later recorded details that read like a nightmare. Altars defiled, a bishop or archbishop among the dead. Some sources name him Archbishop John or Johannes, but names in these records carry uncertainty. Bodies left as a message. When this language shifts from report to legend, we must slow down. The cruelties and their precise forms are often amplified by retelling. Still, the effect on the Swedish psyche was not legend, but panic. The invaders had become the invaded. Panic breeds swift answers. Kings are not made for subtlety once one of their towns burns. The Swedish response, what the sources call a great fleet sent east, was spectacular in scale. Some chronicles even preserve fragments of the numbers. The image these fragments conjure is a flotilla of drakars, rank upon rank, oars like teeth. The leadership is muddied. In transcribed accounts, the king is sometimes given a name resembling Canute or Canute. Variants appear in the records, and historians debate whether this identifies the famous Knut line or another regional leader. The point is not the exact syllables on a page, but the certainty. The crown resolved to punish, to make an example. What followed is a textbook of overconfidence. The Swedish fleet moved with the logic of domination, straight lines, clear headings, expecting coasts to bow and villages to surrender. They prepared for pitched battle and for the capture of men who would be sold or ransomed. They did not prepare for an enemy who had studied their strengths and fashioned a mirror image of cunning. The tribes had planned in ways the king's captains could not foresee. They emptied the coasts. Cattle were driven inland or slaughtered to deprive the victors of foraging. Smoke and blackened fields lay where a victualling party might expect to find supplies. Wells were unheard of lie found to be disturbed or empty in some accounts. In others, the coastline presented itself as if it had been emptied of life. This is strategic deception, old as war and brutal in its logic. Deny your enemy what they seek, and he becomes hungry for more than food, hungry for meaning. The Swedish fleet sailed into an emptiness that was deception. In narrow approaches, heavy-hulled drakars could not maneuver. The lighter skiffs, the craft of the coastal warriors, could weave where the larger ships scraped. At night, the tribes sent fires out into the mists on small rafts that drifted with the current, wrapped in pitch and kindling. These were not the flaming siege ships of later centuries. They were practical, crude devices intended to do a single, terrible thing, light the sky and the sails. Sails burn with a sound like a sudden dry animal. Once alight, a sail collapses. Wind becomes weapon. It pins the ship in place, a vertical pyre that turns oars into useless, blistering paddles. Men try to cut lines in panic. Some jump. If a drakar ground onto a shoal while its canvas smoked, the longships could be trapped like cattle at low tide. In that hour, the advantages of armor and daring dissolved. Heavy shields and braided mail did not save a man who was dragged into water by a burning rope or crushed as hull met reef. There is a certain cruelty to the image. The proud prow stuck and hissing. Sailors flinging themselves into a sea that is too cold or too shallow to hold them. Chroniclers love a moral like that, hubris humiliated in flames, and their renderings do not always separate spectacle from truth. But there are archaeological hints and later testimonies that the method worked. Larger lashings and the sheer momentum of a string of drakars could be exploited by a smaller, more flexible opponent. The tribes did not merely fight, they choreographed failure. The aftermath was worse than any single chronicle could neatly report. Some ships were captured, others burned. Men who might otherwise have been ransomed were killed, left as statements. If one hears again that dramatic phrase, "zero survivors," it is precisely because some chroniclers wrote in absolutes to give their tale moral weight. Historians now warn us, such claims are seldom literal. They are rhetorical, meant to mark a turning point more than to inventory bones. Still, when a royal fleet, the symbol of a kingdom's ability to project power, returns broken or not at all, the political consequences are immediate. Noblemen question the crown. Tributaries mulled the cost of resistance. Rumor becomes a weapon as effective as any spear. At the heart of the Baltic theater was a kind of psychological warfare that modern strategists would admire. Desecration of shrines and symbolic humiliation were not merely brutality. They were statements designed to unfasten confidence. Leave a bishopless cathedral, and a king must answer not only with men, but with legitimacy. Leave a fleet burned, and a monarch's image as protector of the people is scorched in the popular mind. The tribes understood theater, the beach as a stage, the bodies and the burning ships as arguments against arrogance. Yet for all the tactical brilliance and the theater, this was not a clean revolution. The tribes who struck the blows were not immune to the lure of violence, nor were they unified under a single banner. Coalitions fray, victories invite predation. The Baltic peoples who learned to fight the Vikings also knew how vulnerable they remained to other instruments of medieval power: armored cavalry, stone walls, and the ideological clout of the church. The moment of triumph contained its own seeds of danger. What the tribes did in these early conflicts was to force a reconsideration of power in the region. Viking dominance had been not merely military, but institutional, a practiced assumption that the sea belonged to those who could master it. By turning the sea into a trap, the Baltic coastal warriors rewrote that assumption. Suddenly, the question was no longer whether the North could strike eastward at will. It was whether anyone could now claim safety. And so, the map of threat broadened. The Swedish crown, wounded and shamed, began to see enemies it had not fully attended to before. Merchants fretted, coastal settlements fortified, often badly. Messages were sent between princes and bishops. The violence on the water had exposed a political vacuum ashore, a vacuum that would not remain empty for long. Between the tides of raid and reprisal, rumor hardened into policy. Messages flew, banners moved, and in courtly halls where kings argued with bishops over precedence and penitence, talk shifted from local revenge to sustained conquest. The Baltic, once merely a backyard to be raided, became a theater where the instruments of medieval statecraft, crusading rhetoric, fortified castles, and monastic military orders began to appear like new players arriving late to a familiar game. But before those orders could set their banners on the sand, before castles were even raised to withstand the sea's new predators, the warfare that had begun on small, shallow boats taught a wider lesson. Adaptation could beat force when the environment was coded correctly. The tribes had not defeated the Vikings by becoming Vikings. They had beat them by refusing to play by their rules. Yet stories that invert empire do not stop at tactic. They press forward into politics and identity. The dramatic raids and ambushes were a prelude to something both less violent and more consequential. The rearrangement of alliances, the hard bargaining of choice and conversion, the formation of larger polities out of a dozen smaller ones. The men who had once hidden in reeds to burn a sail would, in another generation, be sitting beneath painted tents or within hastily built timber halls, negotiating marriages, titles, and the baptismal rituals that the Western powers prized as currency. But that future, the moment where warcraft becomes diplomacy, where a tribal chieftain counts coin and clergy as carefully as he counts war friends, was not yet on the field when the smoke from the burned dracars still smoldered. The immediate consequence was simpler and more dangerous, a swollen appetite in the courts across the sea. The North, stung, would not let such an affront pass without answer. So they organized a response large enough to punish and monumental enough to be public theater. The king would send fleet after fleet. Leaders from surrounding realms would feel obliged to demonstrate loyalty. Crusade speech and the language of holy war were not yet the dominant frame in the earliest retaliations, but the vocabulary of piety and sin always threaded through the claims of kings who wished to justify violence. The stage was set for escalation, and yet, even as armies and fleets formed and councils met, there was a quiet, brutal conversation happening in the trees and the bays. The coastal warriors did not rest on their laurels. They plotted new variations. The very unpredictability that had undone a king's fleet became their advantage when the crown's ships returned again. Where the northern captains saw shores to subdue, the tribes saw opportunities for theater and trap. Each punitive expedition taught them more. Each failure of the invader confirmed the viability of their methods. When the Swedish force, prideful, heavily manned, and accustomed to victory, finally moved again against the east, they sailed with the confidence of a people who had not yet been disciplined by defeat. They expected to land, punish, and return with recompense. Instead, they found, step by step, that the shore had become a page written in a language they could not read. Villages were silent, fields were black, fires flickered at odd places, small boats slipped out of coves like tongues of smoke. By the time they realized the scale of the deception, it was too late. Ships ran ashore, others were trapped on reef. Captains cut anchors only to find their men clinging to soaked timbers. The sound that followed was not one their sagas had prepared them for. The cry of rout, the clamor of disorder where once there had been order. The sea, which had been their road, became their courtroom. It judged, and it pronounced the severity of their error. There are few clean endings in history. Battles do not always close like a door. But in the months after the coast had been used against them, the North's sense of invulnerability was shattered. Word traveled as it always did, slowly, then like wildfire. Markets whispered the tale. Minstrels turned it into a ballad. Bishops scolded and kings swore vengeance. The tribes, for their part, felt a shift beneath their feet. Actions that began as defense flared into offense. Skiffs that once slipped out to harass now sought opportunity for larger strikes. Confidence breeds its own boldness. If this were only a story about boats and burned sails, it would be small. But the real miracle of this episode, if miracle is the word a historian can permit for an outcome that looks improbable in hindsight, is that an assortment of coastal peoples managed, through a combination of tactical ingenuity and brutal practicality, to force a recalculation across an entire region. The Baltic had become a contested space in a new way. Not merely avenues for raids, but a chessboard where adaptation and statecraft would contend for centuries. The question the North now asked itself was no longer merely how to punish the sea-born brigand. It had become, more ominously, what could challenge the Crown's authority next? Who could stand against a royal fleet that had been humbled? And how would the polity marshalling power against them respond when other forces, knights of a different kind, preachers with papal bulls, and orders of warrior monks who would soon appear from the west, began to march with a rhetoric that blended holiness and land-grabbing? Those questions would draw a different kind of answer, and in doing so, they would change the region into something larger and more modern, with courts, kingship, and baptized alliances. But those coming forces had not yet fully arrived. For the moment, the Baltic tribes remained the authors of their own advantage, crafting a new grammar of war out of reeds and rafts, fire and reputation. If you find this overturning of the familiar tempting, if you enjoy history flipped like a shield and shown from the edge you least expected, subscribe now for more deep dives into the forgotten violences and cleverness that remade medieval Europe. After that small invitation, the story returns to its main pulse. Adaptation pitted against assumption. The Vikings were not a monolith. Some captains never returned to their halls. Some tongues at the hearths shifted in tone. But the old cycles of pillage and tribute were interrupted long enough for something else to creep into being. A sense among the Baltic peoples that they had more than survival on their minds. They had leverage. They had shown that a coordinated and thoughtful use of landscape and craft could defeat brute maritime superiority. This was not simply a military lesson. It was a political argument, and arguments can be louder and more persistent than swords. And because ideas breed institutions, the very success of the coastal tactics attracted new attention. Princes and foreign knights, whose world was couched in stone keeps and armored horses rather than reed masks and shallow boats, watched the Baltic not merely as a source of spoils, but as a theater where new careers could be made. To some, it looked like a land of opportunity. To others, a place of insult that demanded rectification. The humiliation of a royal fleet is the sort of event that invites both revenge and enterprise. It invites those who seek both with different tools. But what the coastal coalition had not anticipated was the nature of the response those tools would prompt. The next wave of challengers would not come simply with more ships. They would arrive with castles, with crossbows, with a vocabulary of crusade that could be used to reframe plunder as pious labor. They would import a model of conquest that married spiritual sanction to territorial ambition. When armored horsemen and stone walls enter a theater that once favored skiffs and snares, the rules change again. The tribe's method of fighting Vikings had been brilliant against ships. It was far less certain against a fortified castle line or against the crossbow bolt that punches through mail. This is the hinge where the maritime insurgency brushes against the continental order. The coastal attacks had proven that adaptation could crack projection. But projection, in turn, changes tactics. It begets technological and ideological responses. New orders would arrive with a mandate: pacify, convert, and hold. They would transform raids into campaigns aimed at control rather than plunder. In that transfer, the daring of the tribes would be tested anew. For now, though, their success had consequences of a different sort. It convinced some local chieftains that alliance and consolidation might be a sensible path. A chieftain who once commanded a bay of skiffs might now see the value in binding with a neighbor who could hold a valley of horses. The grain of political unity was planted not only in the soil of ambition, but in the salt of survival. The men who had burned dracars and raised a cathedral's legitimacy were the same men who would, a generation later, be implicated in negotiations with popes and kings. Their bravery at sea had bought them the bargaining power that could be exchanged for titles, marriages, and, eventually, crowns. Histories like this are never a straight line. They are a braided stream. Tactics and politics braid together into institutions. The immediate effect of the raids and ambushes was to scatter fear among the Scandinavian kingdoms and to give the coastal peoples an unaccustomed confidence. That confidence, however, invited not only admiration, but also envy and intervention. It exposed a gap. The tribes had proven they could beat the invaders at sea, but no single polity among them had yet found a secure way to turn military success into durable security against the multiple threats now pressing at the edges. We end this section at a moment of precarious advantage. The coastal coalition had struck a blow that would echo through the century. The northern fleets returned diminished, their aura punctured. The Baltic coast felt momentarily like a place where the rules could be reimagined, where a reed boat could teach a lesson to a king. But the victory was also a provocation. It read on the continent like a dare, the kind that invites a challenge from those who have greater resources, better fortifications, and an appetite for territorial expansion framed in the language of salvation. When the next wave came, it would not only seek to avenge burned sails, it would bring banners that spoke of conversion, of papal endorsement, and of military orders whose whole being was to hold and to govern. That development belongs to the next chapter of this story, where innovation collides with institutional force, and where political cunning must match military invention. Until then, the Baltic coasts remained alive with the sound of small oars and the whisper of new possibilities. The tribes that had dared the Vikings to fight had not only survived, they had transformed the terms of engagement. The question left open, and the one that would decide the fate of the region in the decades to come, was this: could ingenuity at sea be turned into durable power ashore? Could ingenuity at sea be turned into durable power ashore? The answer arrived in a slow, bloody cadence, not as a single thunderclap, but as a sequence of lessons, reactions, and reinventions that would remake the Baltic world. The first of those answers came in steel and prayer. In the decades after the burned sails, a new kind of actor stepped into the region, men who combined monastic vows with military discipline, knights who wore crosses and built castles. Bishop Albert of Riga, a figure often named in the sources as the clerical promoter of expansion in the eastern Baltic, gathered support for a Christianizing enterprise that also promised land and lordship. With him came the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, commonly called the Sword Brothers, a militant brotherhood whose recruits were promised salvation and booty in equal measure. Their arrival shifted the theater from reed and skiff to rampart and cavalry. The Sword Brothers learned fast. Their early campaigns established fortified posts, carved into the landscape the first real footholds of a continental order. Where the skiffs had used concealment, the brothers used permanence. Timber keeps on promontories, wooden palisades, earthworks, crossbows and heavier armor made raiding more costly. A castle could blunt a coastal strike. A heavily armored knight could ride through a line of light spearmen in the open. The tribes that had dared the Vikings were suddenly confronted by a war machine whose logic was not hit and run, but hold and govern. That logic, however, had limits. The Order's rise produced its own overreach, and overstretched men make mistakes. In 1236, at the Battle of Saul, sometimes spelled Syare or transcribed variably in older texts, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword met an enemy they could not easily outflank, a coalition of Baltic tribes, most prominently the Samogitians and Semigallians, who combined their knowledge of marsh, forest, and light cavalry with a willingness to meet knights chest to chest when the ground favored them. Contemporary chronicles and later medieval annals agree on the outcome, if not on every detail. Saul was a catastrophe for the Sword Brothers. Their force was broken. Many of their knights fell or were captured. The Grandmaster in some late transcriptions is named Volquin, also seen as Vulquin or Vulwin in various sources. The exact rendering varies between manuscripts, and whatever the precise orthography, his order's loss was decisive. Saul did more than shatter an order. It exposed the vulnerability of crusading rhetoric when it was not matched by steady control. The defeat forced a reorganization. The remnants of the Sword Brothers were absorbed into the Teutonic Order in 1237, a merger that brought new discipline, resources, and a continental backbone to the Baltic campaign. The Teutonic Knights, seasoned with recruits from the German principalities and tied to a broader network, would become a different kind of problem for the tribes who had once only watched the sea. Yet even as the Teutonic Order consolidated, other dramatic reversals slowed their momentum. To the east, Novgorod and its prince, Alexander Nevsky is the canonical name found in chronicles, faced the westward push of the same crusading energies. In 1242, on the ice of Lake Peipus, Nevsky's forces met a northern army that had expected to impose its will. The battle that tradition remembers as the Battle on the Ice, details of the exact tactics are debated by historians, use the environment as weapon. Heavy cavalry that had been decisive on open plains found the frozen expanse a treacherous field. Contemporary accounts portray knights slowing, splashing, sometimes plunging as ice gave underweight and momentum. Whether horses truly sank through the ice in great numbers, or whether the image is a chronicler's dramatic flourish, the psychological effect was real. Nevsky's victory halted a push that might otherwise have opened Novgorod to deeper incursions from the west. It was a reminder that mobility and local knowledge could still twist the fate of the armored and the pious. Back in the Baltic littoral, the Teutonic consolidation provoked another wave of responses. The Order poured men and stone into the region, building castles like punctuation marks across the plains and marshes. Each new fortress cut a slice out of the coastal people's freedom to slip, hide, and harass. Crossbows, eventually more common and deadly than the older spear and axe, reached deep into a line of battle and made the battlefield more lethal in the long exchange. Horses, bred for charge, became the instrument of shock. The tribes that had once turned the sea into a noose found themselves vulnerable on land, where a square of mail and a wedge of lances could unwind their skirmishing formations. But their response was not capitulation. The same inventiveness that made fires leap to Viking sails found new forms. The Baltic warriors adapted to castles with ambushes near supply routes, starvation tactics, and targeted night raids. They used the land, forests, marshes, hedged valleys, to fragment the Teutonic lines. They shifted from confronting knights in the open to striking what the Germans relied on most: communication, logistics, and legitimacy. They attacked small detachments, sniped at foraging parties, and raised insurgencies in the wake of heavy-handed campaigns. In the mind of a Teutonic commander, every castle meant another vulnerable line of supply to protect. These pressures coalesced after another symbolic defeat of the Order at Derby, often seen in sources as Derby or Derby, fought in 1260. The battle, in which Samogitian and Semi-Gallian forces routed a Teutonic army, is sometimes described as a local event that had continental reverberations. Chroniclers from Riga and from monastery annals record that the Teutonic loss at Derbe sparked uprisings across the Baltic. Subject peoples, trembling at the thought of permanent conquest and resentful of forced conversions, rose up. Revolt became contagious. The order's expansion stalled in places, coffers emptied and recruits hesitated. Derby showed that the momentary military success of a crusading order could be undone by the social cost of its rule. It was in this churn of battlefield triumphs and deep political anxiety that one man's political dexterity turned the whole region in a new direction. Mindaugas, often transcribed in older texts as Mandalgas or similar variants, a Lithuanian leader, seized the opportunity of the moment. Mindaugas had the taste for power, and the skill to use both baptism and marriage as instruments. Around 1251-1253, he accepted Christian baptism, and in 1253 was crowned King of Lithuania. A coronation recorded in contemporary sources and accepted by many historians as a political milestone. But the conversion was rarely merely spiritual. Mindaugas used his baptism to secure recognition and to blunt the crusading pretext that justified Teutonic incursions. If a ruler could call himself Christian, then conquest in his name became complicated. Mindaugas's pact with the papacy and with neighboring powers was pragmatic. He wanted legitimacy, protection, and time to consolidate. His coronation was not an end to conflict, but a reordering of its terms. With a crowned king at its center, Lithuanian polity began to knit disparate tribes, coastal raiders, hill chieftains, and river valley lords, into a more durable structure. That structure was not an immediate modern state, but a political project, a coalition of elites who could pool manpower, levy resources, and negotiate marriages and alliances. Mindaugas traded raids for titles where he could, and where he could not, he continued to wage war. He balanced between the pressure of the Teutonic order and the threat from Slavic principalities to the east, playing one power against another where advantage presented itself. Still, Mindaugas's political patchwork was fragile. His authority depended on the loyalty of chieftains who prized independence, and his conversion alienated some who saw spiritual submission as political treachery. Assassinations and court intrigues were never far away in medieval politics. Indeed, Mindaugas's own violent death in the early 1260s, accounts vary on exact year and motives, shows the tenuousness of a crown assembled from war and negotiation. Yet the political momentum he initiated did not evaporate with his life. The idea of a larger Lithuanian polity lingered, and the structures he set in motion would be taken up by successors who expanded and consolidated power further inland. What emerges in the decades after Saul, Papus, and Derby is not a single triumphant national narrative, but a braided account of adaptation on both sides. The Teutonic order refined its methods. It built more stone fortresses, developed administrative systems, and recruited nobles from across the Holy Roman lands. Castles like Birgi, Königsberg, a name that would later be attached to the order's Prussian state, and dozens of smaller keeps anchored their authority in the territory. They administered colonists, settled Germans in newly subdued lands, and attempted to reshape the local economy to their advantage. The order's state became an engine of medieval colonial rule, efficient, militarized, and relentless. Against that, the peoples of the Baltic did not simply vanish. Instead, a gradual process of integration, resistance, and political synthesis took place. Many coastal and upland chieftains, who had once burned sails, found that their bargaining power could be used to carve out seats of influence within larger polities. Others fled deeper into marsh and forest, preserving a way of life that the castles could not easily control. And from the confrontation of knight and skiff, a surprising possibility unfolded. A sizable political center, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, began to emerge as a continental power in its own right. The Grand Duchy's rise was neither instant nor inevitable. It took decades of warfare, diplomacy, dynastic marriage, and opportunistic expansion. Yet by the 14th century, Lithuanian rulers presided over a polity that stretched far beyond the reed-bound coastlines of earlier years. They absorbed lands that had once belonged to fragmented principalities, and in the process constructed an administration capable of fielding large cavalry forces. Ironically, the very armature that had once threatened the tribes with destruction. It is a historian's paradox. The techniques that protect a people can also transform them into power objects themselves. Across the Baltic, the long-term consequences were enormous. The Teutonic Order's presence reshaped trade routes, demographic balances, and the meaning of conversion. The defensive ingenuity of the coastal tribes forced northern kings to reckon with limits to seaborne projection. The victories at Sol and Derby and the stand on Lake Peipus did not eliminate crusading ambitions, but they fractured them, delayed them, and made clear that military conquest required far more than piety and steel. The tug-of-war between order and insurgency, between stone and skiff, created a medieval balance of power in which diplomacy, marriage alliances, and religious bargaining mattered as much as any spear. This balance, however, was never stable. The Teutonic Order would remain a potent threat for centuries, expanding its colonizing reach and competing with emerging states over influence and territory. Lithuania, once unified by rulers like Mindaugas and his heirs, would become one of the largest political formations in medieval Europe, stretching into the lands of Rus and creating a frontier that reversed the initial direction of pressure. Not merely barbarians resisting knights, but a continental power shaping politics across the east. In that inversion lies the final irony. The coastal peoples who first learned to fight the Vikings ultimately helped produce a polity that could confront crusading orders as equals. Along the way, memory did its work. Chronicles amplified defeats and victories, often assigning moral meaning to the fortunes of arms. Minstrels and clerics wrote songs and sermons that framed a burned fleet as divine chastisement or heroic martyrdom depending on the teller. Archaeology and careful reading of texts have since complicated every simple narrative. Scholars now emphasize contingency, local agency, and the inevitable imprecision of sources, yet the pattern remains legible. Small practical innovations, lighter boats, night raids, incendiary devices, aggregated into strategic change. Cruelty and fury molded politics. Baptism and coronation reshaped claims to authority. The Baltic became a place where tactic and statecraft collided repeatedly. If one looks for a single moral, it is not that one side was morally superior, or that technology alone determines destiny. The deeper lesson is about hubris and attention. The Vikings, and the princes who claimed their lineage, had assumed that mastery of the sea equaled mastery of the region. That assumption blinded them to the fact that every dominance breeds a counter-design. The coastal peoples paid attention to nuance, how the wind bent around an island, how a tide could strand a longship at the wrong moment, how a bowman could exploit a roof of mail. Their courage was real, but their success also rested on curiosity and adaptation. And adaptation, when it succeeds, invites more consequences than its inventors can foresee. The tribes that dared the Vikings to fight did not remain merely guerrillas of the littoral. Their victories loosened the strictures of fear. Their bargaining power fed political consolidation. Their example altered the way that European powers imagined conquest. Out of reed and flame, out of ambush and prayer, rose courts and crowns, stone keeps and princely alliances. The Baltic's contest with the North was a crucible in which a new medieval order was forged, one in which the line between raider and ruler could be crossed by shrewd men with ambitious aims. This is the arc that ties the outrageous image of burned sails back to the title that brought you here. The tribe that dared the Vikings to fight did far more than lick the wounds of a raiding economy. They forced a tactical revolution. They provoked a militarized response that birthed orders and states, and they helped set the conditions for the emergence of a continental power whose legacy would be felt long after the last Drakkar had rotted into the shallows. In the end, the story is not of a single battle or a single leader, but of a chain reaction. Local ingenuity producing strategic shock, shock provoking institutional response, institutions provoking political synthesis, and synthesis creating a new map of power. That chain was messy, sometimes brutal, and often ambiguous in motive. It was also profoundly modern in its premises. Those who pay attention to the environment, who adapt faster than their enemies, and who can turn tactical success into political capital are the ones who change the course of regions. The burned masts and the songs of the defeated would remain in memory, but so would something else. The sight of small boats vanishing into reeds, the whisper of a plan hatched under a low moon, and the knowledge that a people who once fought to defend their coasts could become architects of a state large enough to command respect across Europe. The tribes that once dared the Vikings did not merely fight, they taught the wider medieval world some painful lessons about the limits of power and the possibility of reinvention. Their daring altered more than a battle line. It shifted the balance of centuries. If this episode turned your picture of the Viking Age on its head, there are more reversals waiting. Watch our deep dive on Alexander Nevsky and the tactics that turned a frozen lake into a historical hinge, and subscribe for other stories of how the small and the clever remade medieval Europe.